Florence's unfilled promise. The bells of Florence ring out across the terracotta rooftops as dawn breaks over the Arno, their bronze voices carrying the weight of centuries. But there is one voice missing from this morning chorus, a silence that hangs like an unfinished sentence over the heart of the city. You know that feeling, don't you? When you've poured everything into something magnificent, something that matters deeply, only to find yourself staring at what feels like an impossible gap between vision and reality. The distance between what you dream of building and what actually stands before you, incomplete and waiting. In the year 1418, that gap was quite literal. It yawned open above the heads of Florentines like a wound in the sky, a circular void 140 feet across, crowning what should have been the most magnificent cathedral in all of Christendom. Santa Maria del Fiore, the Cathedral of St. Mary of the Flower. Even now, 6 centuries later, her name carries the weight of audacious dreams and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from attempting the impossible. For over a century, this opening had remained unfilled. Imagine that, an entire lifetime of human ambition, passed down from grandfather to grandson, all focused on a single, maddening question. How do you close a hole in the sky? The cathedral herself was already a marvel. Her walls rose in bands of green and white marble, geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with mathematical precision. Inside, columns soared toward heaven with the confidence of prayers made stone. But above, there was only emptiness where there should have been triumph. The original architects had been bold beyond measure, or perhaps beyond wisdom. They had designed a dome larger than any built since the Pantheon in Rome, over a millennium earlier. But here's what they hadn't designed: any clear method for actually constructing it. You see, the Romans had their secrets, their particular genius for concrete and compression. But those secrets had been buried with the empire itself. Lost in the long centuries that followed, the knowledge of how to span such impossible distances, how to hold up such tremendous weight, it had simply vanished. Like so many things we think will always be there until suddenly they're not. And so Florence found herself in possession of a magnificent obsession and no clear path forward. The weight of unfulfilled promise pressed down on the city like the very dome they couldn't build. The guildmasters would gather in their meeting halls, these merchant princes who had funded this impossible dream, and you can almost hear the frustration in their voices. The same conversations, year after year. Surely someone, somewhere, knows how to finish what we started. But the architects they consulted would shake their heads, point to the vast opening, and speak in careful terms about the fundamental impossibility of the task. The problem wasn't just size, though that was daunting enough. It was physics itself. How do you build a dome when you can't use the traditional method of wooden scaffolding? The space was too vast, the height too great. The amount of timber required would have stripped bare entire forests. And even if you could somehow construct such scaffolding, the weight would likely crush the cathedral walls beneath it. Then there was the question of the dome's shape. The original design called for something that had never been attempted. Not the perfect hemisphere of Roman engineering, but something more complex, more daring. 8 sides rising to a point, like a flower opening toward heaven. Beautiful in concept, nightmarish in execution. For decades, the opening was simply covered with a temporary roof. Practical, weatherproof, and utterly heartbreaking to anyone who understood what should have been there instead. It was like covering the Mona Lisa's smile with a piece of cardboard. Functional, perhaps, but missing the entire point. The weight of this unfinished business pressed on the city's soul. Florence was becoming the center of a new world. Banking, trade, and art flowing through her streets like tributaries feeding a great river. The Medici were rising to power, their coins financing ventures that stretched from London to Constantinople. Artists and thinkers were gathering here, drawn by the promise of patronage and the electric feeling that something new was being born. But always, there was that hole in the sky, that daily reminder that some dreams might simply be too large for human hands to hold. The citizens developed a peculiar relationship with their unfinished cathedral. Children grew up playing in its shadow, never knowing anything but that empty space above the altar. Merchants conducted business in its nave, their voices echoing in the vast interior that seemed to whisper of incompletion. Brides walked down the aisle toward marriages and futures, while above them hung only absence. There's something profound about living with unfinished greatness, isn't there? It becomes part of the landscape of your daily life. This reminder that human ambition sometimes outstrips human capability. You adapt to it, work around it, but it never quite stops nagging at the corner of your consciousness. The priests would say their masses beneath that void, their Latin prayers rising toward heaven through an opening that seemed almost like a direct line to the divine. Perhaps there was a kind of poetry in that. Worship ascending through incompletion, faith existing in the space between vision and reality. But for the city's leaders, for the men who had staked their reputations and their fortunes on this impossible structure, the unfinished dome was a source of constant, gnawing anxiety. They were builders, these Florentines. They understood that great things required great risks, but they also understood that some risks could destroy you. The Guild of Wool Merchants, who had taken responsibility for the cathedral's completion, met regularly to discuss their impossible inheritance. These were practical men, accustomed to solving problems through careful planning and generous application of gold. But money alone couldn't bridge this particular gap. They needed something rarer than wealth. They needed genius. And genius, as anyone who has ever tried to summon it knows, operates on its own schedule. The years passed. 1380 became 1390, then 1400. A new century dawned, and still the dome remained unbuilt. Architects came and went, each offering theories and sketches, but none willing to stake their reputation on actually attempting the impossible. There were proposals, of course. Build it in sections, some suggested, though no one could explain how to prevent the partially completed structure from collapsing under its own weight. Use chains to hold it together, others offered, though the metallurgy of the age couldn't produce chains strong enough for such a task. The most honest architects simply admitted defeat. The dome, they said, could not be built with current knowledge and technology. Perhaps in 100 years, or 200, someone would discover the secret. But for now, Florence would have to content herself with magnificent incompletion. And yet, there were whispers. Stories of a young man, trained as a goldsmith, who had been asking unusual questions, who had been seen studying the ruins of Roman buildings, measuring and sketching with an intensity that bordered on obsession, who spoke of the dome not as an impossibility, but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. His name was Filippo Brunelleschi, and he carried in his mind something that Florence desperately needed: the dangerous combination of absolute confidence and complete willingness to attempt what everyone else knew couldn't be done. But that part of our story lies ahead of us, in the quiet hours yet to come. For now, let us rest in this moment of suspension, this time when the greatest architectural challenge in the world hung over Florence, like a question mark made of marble and ambition. Sometimes, In the space between problem and solution, between dream and reality, we find something valuable. Not the answer itself, but the particular kind of patience that comes from living with great questions. The understanding that some things worth building cannot be rushed, cannot be forced, but must wait for their proper moment to emerge from impossibility into truth. The bells of Florence continue their ancient rhythm, marking time as they have for centuries, and somewhere in their bronze voices you might hear an echo of that great silence, the space where a dome should be, waiting for someone brave enough to fill it. Enter Brunelleschi, a goldsmith's vision, but in the narrow streets below, where the shadow of that impossible void falls each day at noon, one man refuses to accept the permanence of the unfinished. Filippo Brunelleschi moves through the morning crowds with the measured gait of someone whose mind never truly rests. At 41, he carries himself with the quiet confidence that comes from a lifetime of solving problems others deemed unsolvable. His hands, weathered from years at the goldsmith's bench, scarred by countless hours shaping metal into forms that existed first only in imagination. These hands know the language of materials in ways that pure theory never could. You might recognize something in his restless energy, that familiar weight of seeing solutions where others see only obstacles, the burden of understanding that what you're building requires not just vision, but the patient mastery of countless small details that no one else will ever notice. Brunelleschi learned this patience early. Born into a family of modest means, he was apprenticed at 14 to one of Florence's most demanding goldsmiths. While other boys played in the piazzas, he bent over delicate work, learning to coax precious metals into impossible curves, to join disparate pieces into seamless wholes. Each commission was a puzzle. How to make gold flow like water, how to give weight to air, how to capture light itself in static form. But it was never enough to simply follow established techniques. Even as an apprentice, Brunelleschi questioned everything. Why did certain alloys hold their strength while others failed? What made one joint invisible while another betrayed itself under stress? His master, initially irritated by the endless questions, gradually came to recognize something extraordinary in this young man's hunger for understanding. The weight you carry as a leader, that constant pressure to find new ways forward when the old paths have been exhausted. Brunelleschi knew this intimately. By his 20s, he had mastered every conventional goldsmithing technique Florence had to offer. Yet mastery, he discovered, was not an end, but a beginning. It was the foundation upon which true innovation could be built. He began to study architecture with the same obsessive attention he had once devoted to metalwork. But where others saw buildings as collections of established forms, Brunelleschi saw systems, complex relationships between materials, forces, and space that could be understood, analyzed, and ultimately reimagined. The great dome of the Pantheon in Rome became his obsession. Multiple times he made the arduous journey south, spending days lying on his back beneath that impossible span of concrete, tracing with his eyes the subtle curves that had defied gravity for over 1,000 years. He measured shadows, calculated angles, studied the way light moved across the coffered surface as the sun traced its daily arc. But it was the questions that drove him. How had the Romans mixed their concrete to achieve such strength? Why did the dome grow thinner toward its apex without losing structural integrity? Most crucially, how had they supported such massive weight during construction without the forest of wooden scaffolding that conventional wisdom demanded? You know this feeling, don't you? That moment when you realize the conventional approach to your challenge isn't just inadequate, it's fundamentally wrong. When what you're building demands not just harder work, but entirely different thinking. Back in Florence, Brunelleschi began to share his ideas about the Great Dome. The response was predictably skeptical. The city's established architects, comfortable with their Gothic traditions and proven methods, saw this goldsmith's theories as the fantasies of an outsider. Stone, they argued, behaved according to well-understood principles. Domes of the size required for Santa Maria del Fiore were simply impossible without massive external buttressing, the kind that would destroy the cathedral's elegant proportions. But Brunelleschi had seen something they had not. In his careful study of Roman techniques, he had discovered that the ancients understood something about the behavior of masonry that medieval builders had forgotten. Stone, properly arranged, could support itself during construction. A dome could, in essence, build itself, each ring of stones supporting the next, the structure growing stronger as it rose. The mathematics were complex, but the principle was elegant. Instead of fighting gravity, the dome would use gravity. Instead of requiring external support, it would achieve stability through its own carefully calculated form. It was the kind of solution that seems obvious only after someone brave enough to see it has pointed the way. Yet knowing the solution and implementing it were entirely different challenges. The dome Brunelleschi envisioned would require innovations in every aspect of construction. New machines to lift stones to unprecedented heights, new techniques for maintaining perfect curves across a span that dwarfed any previous attempt. New methods of organization to coordinate the work of hundreds of craftsmen with precision that allowed no margin for error. Perhaps this resonates with your own experience of leadership. That moment when you see clearly what needs to be built, but realize that creating it will require inventing new capabilities, new systems, new ways of working that don't yet exist. The weight of knowing that your vision is sound, but that proving it will demand everything you have, and probably more than you think you possess. Brunelleschi understood that technical innovation alone would not be enough. Florence was a city that respected tradition, that moved carefully when vast sums and civic pride were at stake. He would need to win not just the intellectual argument, but the deeper battle for trust and confidence. He would need to demonstrate not just what could be built, but that he was the man to build it. So he began with smaller projects, a foundling hospital that showcased his understanding of proportion and engineering, a church that revealed his mastery of both classical principles and practical construction. Each commission was simultaneously an end in itself and a stepping stone, proof of capabilities that would be essential for the great work to come. His reputation grew slowly, methodically. Those who worked with him discovered that this former goldsmith possessed an almost supernatural ability to visualize complex three-dimensional relationships. He could see how forces would flow through a structure before the first stone was laid. He could anticipate problems that wouldn't become apparent to others until construction was well underway. But perhaps most importantly, he could communicate his vision in ways that made the impossible seem achievable. When he spoke of the dome, it was not as a fantasy, but as a series of specific, solvable problems. The curve that would distribute weight most efficiently, the materials that would provide strength without excessive mass, the sequence of construction that would maintain stability at every stage. You understand this challenge, don't you? The need to translate vision into language that others can grasp and believe in. The delicate balance between confidence and humility that allows people to trust you with their resources, their time, their hopes for what you're building together. By 1418, when the Opera del Duomo finally announced their competition for the dome's design, Brunelleschi had been preparing for over a decade. While others scrambled to develop proposals, he had already solved the fundamental challenges. While they debated theory, he had tested solutions. While they worried about the impossibility of the task, He had mapped the path from impossibility to completion. Yet he knew that winning the commission would be only the beginning. The dome he envisioned would take decades to complete. It would require sustained excellence from hundreds of workers across years when mistakes could be catastrophic. It would demand innovations not just in design, but in project management, quality control, and the complex human dynamics of large-scale collaboration. The weight of such responsibility might have crushed a lesser vision, but Brunelleschi had learned something in those years of patient preparation. The same principles that governed the behavior of stone and metal also applied to human endeavor. Proper foundation, careful planning, attention to the relationships between parts and whole. These could transform even the most ambitious dreams into achievable reality. Standing in the Piazza del Duomo as the competition deadline approached, looking up at that great void that had defined Florence's skyline for over a century, Brunelleschi felt not anxiety, but anticipation. The impossible was about to become inevitable. The space that had waited so long for its proper solution was about to receive it. And in the bronze voices of the cathedral bells, marking time as they had for generations, there was now a different quality to their song. No longer the sound of waiting, but the rhythm of work about to begin. The understanding that true innovation requires not just vision, but the patient development of capabilities that make vision achievable. That what you're building, if it's truly worth building, will demand you become someone you've never been before. The goldsmith's hands that had learned to shape precious metals into impossible forms were about to attempt their greatest work, not in gold or silver, but in stone and brick, and the careful orchestration of human ambition toward a goal that would outlast them all. The great competition, innovation against tradition. The year 1418 brought with it more than just the turning of seasons. It brought a decision that would echo through the centuries. The Opera del Duomo, those guardians of Florence's greatest ambition, could no longer bear the weight of indecision. For over a century, their cathedral had stood incomplete, its soaring walls reaching toward heaven, only to end in empty air where the dome should crown their achievement. And so they did what Florence had always done when faced with impossible choices. They turned it into a competition. The announcement, when it came, sent ripples through every workshop, every guild hall, every gathering place where ambitious minds congregated. The Opera del Duomo would hear proposals for completing the dome, but with one crucial stipulation that separated the dreamers from the builders. No solution could rely upon the traditional method of wooden scaffolding. You see, the mathematics were as unforgiving as they were simple. To scaffold the interior of that vast space would require more timber than existed in all of Tuscany. The cost alone would bankrupt not just the opera, but perhaps the entire city. And even if such resources could be found, the weight of that scaffolding would likely collapse the very structure it was meant to support. It was a constraint that might have seemed like an impossible limitation. But for minds like Brunelleschi's, constraints have always been the birthplace of innovation. Word of the competition reached him in his workshop, where the familiar scent of metal and fire had become the backdrop to increasingly ambitious dreams. His hands, still bearing the calluses of the goldsmith's trade, set down the delicate work before him. Here was the moment he had been preparing for through all those years of study, all those careful observations of Roman engineering, all those smaller projects that had built his reputation brick by careful brick. But he would not be alone in this pursuit. The competition drew minds from across Italy and beyond, architects whose names were already carved in marble across a dozen cities, engineers whose bridges spanned the most challenging rivers, artists whose vision had transformed the very idea of what buildings could become. Among them stood Lorenzo Ghiberti, a man whose reputation cast a long shadow across Florence. Where Brunelleschi was the methodical innovator, Ghiberti was the established master, a sculptor and architect whose bronze doors for the baptistery had earned him not just acclaim, but something far more valuable in the world of Renaissance patronage: trust. The two men could hardly have been more different in their approaches. Ghiberti represented the refinement of existing knowledge, the perfection of techniques handed down through generations of master craftsmen. His proposals would be elegant, proven, built upon the solid foundation of what had worked before. Brunelleschi represented something else entirely: the willingness to abandon the safety of tradition when tradition proved inadequate to the task at hand. As the day of presentations approached, Florence itself seemed to hold its breath. In taverns and marketplaces, wagers were made not just on who might win, but on whether anyone could truly solve what had remained unsolved for so long. The dome had become more than an architectural challenge. It had become a test of human ingenuity itself. The presentations were to be held in the cathedral itself, beneath the very void that awaited completion. There, surrounded by soaring columns and filtered light, each competitor would make their case before the Opera del Duomo and a gathering of Florence's most influential citizens. When Brunelleschi's turn came, he carried with him not just drawings and calculations, but working models, miniature demonstrations of principles that most had never seen before. His voice, when he spoke, carried the quiet confidence of a man who had tested his theories not just in thought, but in the physical realm of wood and metal and stone. He described a dome that would build itself, each ring of bricks supporting the next, rising in a carefully calculated spiral that distributed weight not downward into expensive scaffolding, but outward into the very walls that already stood complete. It was engineering that worked with the forces of nature rather than against them, that turned the dome's own weight into its structural strength. But perhaps most revolutionary of all were his plans for the machines that would make such construction possible. Here, his background as a goldsmith revealed its true value, for in working with precious metals, he had learned to think in terms of precision, of mechanical advantage, of tools that could accomplish what human hands alone could never achieve. He described lifting devices that could raise massive stones to heights that had never been attempted, pulleys and counterweights and gear systems that would allow a few men to do the work of hundreds. These were not just theoretical concepts, but working designs based on principles he had tested and refined through years of smaller projects. The assembled dignitaries listened with the careful attention of men who understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This was not merely a proposal for completing their cathedral. It was a glimpse into a new way of thinking about the relationship between human ambition and physical possibility. When Ghiberti presented his own solution, it carried the weight of established wisdom and proven technique. His approach was more conventional, relying on methods that had been tested across generations of building projects. Where Brunelleschi proposed revolution, Ghiberti offered evolution. The careful refinement of existing knowledge applied to an admittedly extraordinary challenge. The debate that followed was as much about philosophy as it was about engineering. Should Florence trust its greatest architectural ambition to untested innovation or to the refined application of proven methods? Was it wiser to leap boldly into the unknown or to advance carefully along paths that others had walked before? For you, lying there in the darkness with tomorrow's challenges weighing on your mind, perhaps there's something familiar in this moment of decision. How often have you faced the choice between the safety of conventional wisdom and the uncertain promise of a new approach? How many times have you stood before those who hold the keys to your ambitions, trying to convince them that what has never been done before can indeed be accomplished. The Opera del Duomo deliberated through long hours, weighing not just the technical merits of each proposal, but the deeper question of what kind of city Florence wished to become. Were they builders who would be remembered for their caution, or for their willingness to attempt what others deemed impossible? When their decision came, it satisfied no one completely. And perhaps, for that very reason, it proved to be exactly what the moment required. They would award the commission jointly to both Brunelleschi and Ghiberti. Let established wisdom and revolutionary innovation work side by side. Let the proven master and the ambitious innovator combine their strengths toward a goal that would demand the best of both approaches. It was a decision born not of indecision, but of the recognition that some challenges are too great for any single vision, no matter how brilliant. The dome that would crown their cathedral would need both the reliability of tested methods and the breakthrough thinking that could transcend traditional limitations. For Brunelleschi, it was not the complete victory he might have hoped for, but it was something perhaps more valuable. It was the chance to prove that his revolutionary ideas could work not just in theory, but in the unforgiving reality of stone and mortar and the careful coordination of human effort toward an impossible goal. The goldsmith who had learned to shape precious metals into forms that seemed to defy their own nature was about to discover whether those same principles could be applied to a challenge that would test not just his technical knowledge, but his ability to lead, to inspire, to hold fast to his vision, even when working alongside those who questioned its very foundations. The competition was over, but the true test was just beginning. Brick by brick, the dome rises. The first morning of construction dawned gray and cold over Florence, mist clinging to the cathedral's unfinished walls like uncertainty itself. Workers gathered in the shadow of the great opening above, their faces turned upward toward the void they had been tasked to fill. Some crossed themselves, others simply stared. Brunelleschi arrived before sunrise, as he would every morning for the next 16 years. He carried no grand plans rolled in leather tubes, no dramatic gestures of authority. Instead, he moved among the stonemasons and bricklayers with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent countless hours visualizing exactly what needed to happen first. "We begin with trust," he told his foreman, a weathered Tuscan named Marco, whose hands bore the scars of 30 years working stone. Trust in the brick, trust in the pattern, trust that each piece placed correctly will hold the next. The weight you carry in your own work, you know this feeling. That moment when preparation must give way to action, when all the planning and visualization faces its first real test, when you must trust that the foundation you've built can support what you're about to place upon it. The herringbone pattern Brunelleschi had conceived was deceptively simple in concept, revolutionary in execution. Rather than laying bricks in traditional horizontal courses that would require massive wooden centering to prevent collapse, he proposed a spiral pattern that would rise like a flower blooming upward, each ring of bricks locked into place by those that came before. Picture it in your mind. Each brick carefully angled, not merely resting upon its neighbor, but wedged into position, creating a continuous chain of compression that grew stronger with each addition. The pattern resembled the bones of a fish, or the weave of a basket, or perhaps the way thoughts in your own mind sometimes connect, one insight supporting the next, until a complete understanding emerges. But knowing the theory and executing it 60 meters above the cathedral floor, these were different challenges entirely. The first test came with the transportation of materials. Traditional construction could rely on ramps and pulleys designed for predictable loads, But Brunelleschi's dome required precision placement of individual bricks, each one carried to exactly the right position at exactly the right moment. A single misplaced brick could compromise the structural integrity of an entire section. He had designed machines for this, devices that would have seemed fantastical to earlier generations of builders. A massive ox-driven hoist that could lift over 1,000 pounds of stone or brick in a single operation. More remarkably, a reversible gear system that allowed the same animals to raise or lower loads without changing direction. An innovation that would not appear elsewhere for decades. The workers initially viewed these machines with suspicion. Change, even beneficial change, carries its own weight of uncertainty. But as days passed into weeks, as the great wheels turned and lifted their burdens skyward with unprecedented efficiency, skepticism gave way to something approaching wonder. Ghiberti, meanwhile, found himself increasingly marginalized. His expertise in traditional construction methods, his reputation built on proven techniques, these seemed less relevant with each passing day. The Joint Commission that had seemed so diplomatic now revealed itself as what Brunelleschi had perhaps intended all along, a way to begin the work, while gradually demonstrating that innovation, not tradition, would complete it. You understand this dynamic, the tension between established ways and necessary evolution. How progress sometimes requires not just new ideas, but the delicate management of those who represent the old ones. Ghiberti was not incompetent. He was simply working within a framework that this particular challenge had rendered obsolete. By the third month of construction, Ghiberti's visits to the site had become sporadic. He would arrive, survey the rising dome with an expression that mixed admiration with bewilderment, exchange a few words with Brunelleschi about scheduling or materials, then depart. The goldsmith had become, in effect, the sole architect of Florence's greatest ambition. But with sole authority came sole responsibility. And the weight of that responsibility grew heavier with each ring of bricks. The herringbone pattern required absolute precision. A deviation of even a few degrees in the angle of placement could create stress points that would propagate upward, potentially causing catastrophic failure when the dome reached its full height. Brunelleschi found himself checking and rechecking each section, sometimes ordering the removal and replacement of work that appeared perfect to everyone else. "The dome will tell us if we are wrong," he would say, when questioned about his exacting standards. "But it will not tell us gently, and it will not tell us until it is too late to correct the error." The workers began to understand that they were not merely laying bricks. They were participating in a kind of architectural conversation. Each piece placed was both a statement and a question. Will you hold? Can you bear what comes next? The dome's rising form was its answer, growing stronger and more confident with each passing week. Winter brought new challenges. Frost could crack mortar before it set properly. Ice made the scaffolding treacherous. The shorter days meant fewer hours of productive work, while the materials themselves contracted and expanded with temperature changes that had to be accounted for in the placement calculations. Brunelleschi adapted, as you have learned to adapt when circumstances shift around your own work. He developed new mortar mixtures that cured more reliably in cold weather. He redesigned the work schedules to maximize the use of available daylight. Most importantly, he maintained the morale of his workers through the simple expedient of sharing his vision with them. "Look," he would say during the brief midday breaks, pointing upward at their progress. "See how each ring grows smaller than the one below? We are not just building upward. We are building inward. Every day brings us closer to the moment when we place the final stone and step back to see what we have accomplished together." This is perhaps the most crucial skill of leadership under pressure. helping others see not just the immediate task before them, but their role in something larger than themselves. The weight you carry includes this responsibility: to hold the complete vision when others can see only their small part of it. As spring returned to Florence, the dome had risen high enough to be visible from the surrounding hills. Travelers approaching the city would see it first, a promise of completion, where for over a century there had been only absence. The psychological effect on the Florentines themselves was profound. Their impossible dream was taking physical form, brick by careful brick. But with visibility came scrutiny. Other architects arrived from across Italy and beyond, ostensibly to admire, but actually to identify flaws in Brunelleschi's approach. Some predicted imminent collapse. Others questioned whether the structure could possibly support its own weight once complete. A few suggested that the entire project should be abandoned before it became a catastrophic failure that would bankrupt the city. Brunelleschi weathered these criticisms with the same methodical patience he applied to construction itself. He would listen, consider whether any valid concerns had been raised, then return to his work. The dome would prove or disprove his theories more definitively than any argument. The most challenging period came during the fourth year of construction, when the dome had risen high enough that the curvature became pronounced. This was the critical test of the herringbone pattern, the point where traditional construction would have required massive internal supports to prevent the walls from collapsing inward. Instead, the dome held, more than held. It seemed to grow stronger as it curved, each ring of bricks locked more securely into place by the geometry itself. Workers who had initially needed to be coaxed to work at such heights now moved with confidence across the curved surface, trusting their lives to the structure they were creating. Marco, the foreman, captured the feeling perfectly. It is like building a bridge to heaven, except the bridge holds itself up. You know this moment in your own endeavors, when the foundation you have carefully laid finally proves its worth. When the systems you have built begin to support not just their intended function, but possibilities you had not even imagined. When doubt gives way to momentum, and momentum begins to generate its own confidence. The dome continued to rise, brick by brick, ring by ring, each day bringing Florence closer to the completion of its impossible dream. And at the center of it all, the goldsmith who had dared to believe that the principles governing small, precious things might also govern the largest ambitions of human civilization. The true test, as it always is, lay not in the conception, but in the execution. Not in the moment of inspiration, but in the thousand small decisions that transform vision into reality. The dome was teaching Florence, and Florence was learning to trust. The unsung heroes, labor and dedication. But trust, as you well know from the weight you carry, is not built through grand gestures alone. It emerges from the accumulated evidence of countless small acts, from the steady proof that what seems impossible can become inevitable through human dedication. And so we must speak now of those whose names history did not preserve, but whose hands shaped every stone, whose backs bore every burden, whose faith in something larger than themselves made Brunelleschi's vision possible. The masons arrived at dawn, when Florence still lay wrapped in morning mist. They came from the neighborhoods beyond the city center, men whose fathers had worked stone, whose sons would learn the trade by watching, by listening, by feeling the weight of hammer in hand. They carried simple tools, chisels worn smooth by years of use, mallets balanced to their particular grip, measuring strings that had guided 1,000 careful cuts. These were not the celebrated architects whose names would echo through centuries. They were the unsung heroes of ambition made manifest, the steady hands that transformed drawings into reality, one stone at a time. Picture them, if you will, as they gathered each morning in the shadow of the rising dome, the foreman calling out the day's assignments, the careful distribution of materials, the quiet conversations about technique, about family, about the work that filled their days and fed their children. They spoke in the dialect of their neighborhoods, using words that had been passed down through generations of builders. Some specialized in cutting the sandstone blocks that formed the dome's foundation courses. Others shaped the lighter bricks that would spiral upward in Brunelleschi's revolutionary herringbone pattern. The most skilled worked the delicate pietra serena, that gray stone that would frame windows and doorways with mathematical precision. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, the true audacity of what they were attempting. A mason who had spent his life building walls and towers could feel in his bones the difference between conventional construction and this soaring experiment. They knew the weight of stone, the stress points where structures failed, the signs that warned of collapse, and yet they climbed the scaffolding each morning. They positioned each block with meticulous care. They trusted in Brunelleschi's vision even when their experience whispered warnings about spans too wide, heights too ambitious, loads too great for mortal engineering to bear. This was not blind faith. These men were craftsmen, practical experts who had learned their trade through years of careful observation. They could read stone like you read the subtle signals in a difficult negotiation. They knew when mortar was properly mixed, when joints were true, when the fundamental mathematics of construction were being respected or violated. Their trust in the project grew not from ignorance, but from daily evidence. Each course of bricks that held firm, each test of the herringbone pattern that proved stronger than conventional laying, each small innovation that solved a problem they had thought unsolvable. The dome was earning their confidence through performance, just as what you're building earns trust through consistent delivery on promises made. The work was punishing. Imagine the physical demands, carrying materials up increasingly steep ramps as the dome rose higher, sandstone blocks that required 4 men to lift, buckets of mortar that grew heavier with each step upward, tools that had to be hauled to working height and lowered again at day's end. The summer heat was merciless. Stone and brick absorbed the Tuscan sun until they burned to touch. The winter brought different challenges. Mortar that wouldn't set properly in the cold, hands too numb for delicate work, rain that turned the construction site into treacherous mud. And always, the height. As the dome rose, the masons found themselves working at elevations that would have terrified their fathers. The ground fell away beneath them until Florence spread out like a map, the Arno winding through the valley, the hills rolling toward distant mountains. Some grew comfortable with the height. Others never did. But they climbed the scaffolding anyway, day after day, because the work demanded it. They developed their own culture up there in the sky, shared meals at midday, sitting on stone blocks with their legs dangling over the edge, stories told during brief rest breaks, tales of other projects, other cities, other impossible things they had helped to build. They sang sometimes while they worked, old songs that matched the rhythm of hammer on chisel, melodies that had accompanied stone cutting for centuries. The older masons became teachers, passing on techniques that couldn't be learned from drawings or written instructions. How to read the grain in a block of sandstone, where it would split cleanly and where it would crumble. How to judge the consistency of mortar by sound, the particular note a trowel makes when the mixture is perfect. How to position your body when lifting heavy stones, using legs and back in harmony to avoid the injuries that ended careers. The younger men brought energy and ambition. They were the ones willing to work the most dangerous positions, hanging from ropes to set stones in places where scaffolding couldn't reach. They competed quietly among themselves. Who could cut the most precise joint? Who could work fastest without sacrificing quality? Who could solve the small puzzles that arose daily in construction of this complexity? And slowly, month by month, they began to understand that they were part of something extraordinary. This was not just another commission, another church or palace or defensive wall. This dome was attempting to surpass anything built since ancient Rome. If they succeeded, their handiwork would stand for centuries. Children not yet born would look up at stones they had positioned, joints they had sealed, curves they had shaped with their own tools. The weight of that responsibility was both burden and inspiration. Every mason knew that his work would be scrutinized by masters who came after, that any shortcuts or careless moments would be visible forever. But they also knew that they were contributing to something that would outlive them, that their names might be forgotten, but their craftsmanship would endure. They watched Brunelleschi move among them, checking joints, adjusting techniques, solving problems that arose from the collision between theory and practice. He was not a distant master issuing commands from below. He climbed the scaffolding daily, examined their work closely, listened to their concerns about structural challenges they could feel in their hands before any drawing could predict them. The relationship between architect and craftsman deepened through shared risk. When questions arose about whether a particular section could bear the planned load, Brunelleschi didn't retreat to his workshop to recalculate. He stood with the masons, studying the actual stones, feeling the real stresses, making adjustments based on what the work itself was teaching them. This collaboration between vision and execution, between the mind that conceived and the hands that built, became the true foundation of the dome's success. Neither could have succeeded alone. Brunelleschi's revolutionary design needed craftsmen skilled enough to execute it. The masons' expertise needed a vision worthy of their dedication. They were writing the future together, one stone at a time. As the dome approached completion, something remarkable happened among the workers. The natural human tendency toward complaint and criticism, the grumbling that accompanies any difficult project, gave way to something closer to reverence. They could see what they had accomplished. They could feel the strength of the structure they had built with their own hands. The dome was holding. The revolutionary herringbone pattern was working exactly as Brunelleschi had promised. The weight was distributing properly. The span was stable. What had seemed impossible when they began now seemed inevitable. As if this dome had always been destined to crown Florence's cathedral. But they knew better. They remembered the uncertainty, the experiments, the moments when failure seemed more likely than success. They had lived through every challenge, solved every problem, made every adjustment that transformed a brilliant theory into solid reality. The pride they felt was different from the satisfaction of completing ordinary work. This was the deep fulfillment that comes from participating in something larger than yourself, from knowing that your individual contribution helped achieve what no individual could have accomplished alone. They had become part of Florence's story, part of the Renaissance itself, part of humanity's ongoing conversation with the impossible. And perhaps this is what speaks most directly to you, lying there in the quiet hours when the weight of what you're building feels heaviest. The reminder that every significant achievement, every breakthrough that changes how we see what's possible, depends ultimately on people willing to show up day after day to contribute their expertise and effort and faith to something larger than themselves. Your vision, like Brunelleschi's dome, will succeed or fail based on the accumulated dedication of individuals who choose to trust in what you're building, who climb the scaffolding each morning despite uncertainty, who solve problems with their hands and hearts as much as their minds, who find meaning in contributing to something that will outlast them. The Dome of Florence still stands, not because of one man's genius, but because hundreds of people believed that impossible things become inevitable through human dedication, carefully applied, stone by stone, day by day, together. A legacy in stone, the dome's completion and enduring spirit. And so, in the spring of 1436, 18 years after that first impossible vision took shape in Brunelleschi's mind, the final stone was placed. The last curve of the dome completed its perfect arc against the Tuscan sky. What had begun as Florence's greatest impossibility had become, quite simply, reality. The consecration ceremony drew thousands. Pope Eugenius himself traveled from Rome to bless what many called the eighth wonder of the world. But perhaps the most profound moment came not during the grand ceremony, but in the quiet hours before dawn on that sacred day, when the first light of morning touched the completed dome and cast its shadow across the city below. Florence had awakened to find itself transformed. For you see, the weight you carry tonight, that sense that what you're building might be too ambitious, too uncertain. Brunelleschi understood this intimately. He had spent nearly 2 decades living with the possibility that his great work might fail, that the dome might crack, that the revolutionary techniques might prove insufficient, that history would remember him not as a visionary, but as the man who brought down Florence's cathedral. Yet here was the paradox he discovered, and one that echoes through every generation of those who build impossible things. The very weight that keeps you awake at night, that sense of enormous responsibility for what you're creating. This is not your burden to bear alone. It is the foundation upon which greatness is built. The dome rose not because Brunelleschi eliminated uncertainty, but because he learned to work alongside it. Each morning, as he climbed the scaffolding to inspect the previous day's work, he carried the same questions that visit you in the small hours. Will this hold? Am I leading people toward something worthy, or toward spectacular failure? Is the vision clear enough, strong enough, to justify the faith others have placed in it? But watch what happened as the dome took shape. With each ring of bricks laid in that revolutionary herringbone pattern, with each successful test of the lifting machines, with each problem solved through ingenuity rather than brute force, something remarkable occurred. The impossible became inevitable. Not through the elimination of doubt, but through the patient accumulation of small certainties. Stone by stone, decision by decision, day by day. The completed dome measured over 140 feet across its base. It rose nearly 400 feet above the cathedral floor. It contained over 4 million bricks, each one placed by human hands, guided by human judgment. Yet these numbers, impressive as they are, tell only part of the story. The true measure of what was accomplished lies not in the statistics, but in what the dome represented to those who built it, and to those who witnessed its rise. For the masons who had spent years perfecting Brunelleschi's techniques, the completion brought a profound sense of vindication. They had believed in methods that contradicted centuries of established practice. They had trusted their hands to work with materials in ways their fathers had never imagined. They had become, without quite realizing it, pioneers of a new age of building. For the citizens of Florence, The dome's completion marked something even more significant. It proved that their city, their people, their collective will could achieve what Rome at its height had not attempted. The dome became a declaration that the age of impossibility was ending, and that human ingenuity, properly applied, could reshape the world itself. And for Brunelleschi, now approaching 60, his hair silver, his hands marked by decades of working with stone and metal, the completion brought not triumph, but a deeper understanding. He had not conquered the impossible. He had simply learned to listen to it, to work with its constraints rather than against them, to find in limitation the very source of innovation. The techniques he developed for the dome spread throughout Europe and beyond. The double-shell construction, the herringbone brickwork, the innovative lifting machines, these became the foundation for architectural achievements that would define the Renaissance. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the great cathedrals of the North, the palaces and civic buildings that would house the flowering of human culture in the centuries to come. But perhaps the most important legacy was less tangible and more essential. Brunelleschi had demonstrated that the greatest achievements arise not from individual genius working in isolation, but from visionary thinking combined with collaborative execution, from the marriage of impossible dreams and possible actions. The dome stands today, nearly 6 centuries later, as magnificent as the day it was completed. Visitors from around the world climb its internal passages and emerge onto the external gallery to find Florence spread below them like a living map of human achievement. They see the red tile roofs, the ancient bridges, the hills rolling away toward distant mountains. They see a city that learned to build impossible things. And in that moment, many of them experience what the original builders knew, that sense of contributing to something larger than themselves, something that will endure long after their own brief passage through this world. This is what calls to you in the work you're building now. Not the promise of easy success or guaranteed outcomes, but the deeper satisfaction of creating something worthy of the effort it demands, something that justifies the weight you carry, the sleepless nights, the constant questioning of whether you're strong enough, wise enough, persistent enough to see it through. The dome teaches us that you are, not because the path will be smooth. Brunelleschi faced setbacks, political challenges, technical failures, moments of profound doubt. Not because the vision will remain unchanged. The final dome differed in countless details from his original conception, but because the very act of building impossible things changes us in ways that make us equal to the challenge. Each problem solved makes you more capable of solving the next. Each small success builds the foundation for larger achievements. Each person who joins your effort and contributes their own skills and dedication multiplies what becomes possible. The weight you carry tonight, let it settle into something more sustainable. Let it become not the crushing pressure of impossible expectations, but the steady force that shapes diamond from carbon. The patient pressure that, applied consistently over time, transforms the impossible into the inevitable. Florence's dome began as one man's impossible vision. It became reality through the accumulated efforts of hundreds of people who chose to believe that their daily work mattered, that their contribution, however small it might seem, was essential to something magnificent. Your work carries the same potential, the same promise, the same quiet nobility that comes from building something worthy of the effort it demands. The dome's completion in 1436 marked not an ending, but a beginning. It announced to the world that the age of passive acceptance was over, that human beings, working together with vision and persistence, could reshape reality itself. It launched what we now call the Renaissance, not through grand proclamation, but through the simple act of proving that impossible things could be built, stone by stone, day by day, together. And so tonight, as you finally allow your mind to settle, as the weight you carry transforms from burden to foundation, remember that you are part of an ancient tradition, the tradition of those who look at impossible things and see, not obstacles, but invitations. Invitations to become more than you thought possible, to build more than seemed achievable, to leave behind something that justifies the weight you willingly carry. The dome of Florence rises still against the Tuscan sky, its perfect curve a testament to the power of human persistence guided by vision, its stones held in place not by force, but by understanding, its legacy measured not in the centuries it has already endured, but in the inspiration it continues to provide to every generation of builders who follow. And as the last light fades and the city settles into the quiet rhythms of night, the dome stands as it has for nearly 600 years, a permanent reminder that the impossible becomes inevitable when human dedication is carefully applied, stone by stone, day by day, together, until what began as one person's impossible dream becomes humanity's lasting achievement.